Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories of the Age of Exploration, and explorers whose names you likely know, but whose stories you might not. First is the story of Ferdinand Magellan, and the ignominious end to his famous expedition. Then, the History Guy tells the story of Vitus Bering, a Danish sailor who explored the Russian Far East and Alaska. In between, we talk about exploration, European colonization, and just how easy it is for history to be lost. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
If you studied history in high school, you might have heard that Ferdinand Magellan was the first person to circumnavigate the globe. And if that's what you heard or that's what you remember, you would be wrong. While Magellan's expedition from 1519 to 1522 was the first to circumnavigate the globe, Magellan himself didn't make it the whole way. He actually died in 1521 in the kingdom of Mactan, which is part of the modern-day country of the Philippines. And it was another one of his officers, Juan Sebastian Elcano, who actually completed the circumnavigation of the globe. But it's not just interesting that Magellan didn't make it the whole way, and that people in the West don't seem to remember that Magellan didn't make it the whole way, because it's important why Magellan didn't make it the whole way. Because in the Philippines, the death of Ferdinand Magellan is considered one of the most important events in history, and here in the West, we really have no idea that he even died. And we really should know how and why he died, because it provides a really great lesson on the nature of the era of discovery and conquest. And it explains a lot about world politics today. And so today we are going to remember the well-remembered in the Philippines and forgotten in the Western world 1521 Battle of Mactan. To understand how Magellan came to die in the Philippine Islands, you have to understand a little bit about how Magellan came to be in the Philippine Islands. And that all has to do with a treaty that was signed in 1494 between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. And essentially, the purpose of the treaty was to divide up the New World between Portugal and Spain. Now, understand, this treaty didn't pay any attention to the interests of, say, other European countries in the New World, and it certainly didn't pay any attention to the interests of hundreds of millions of indigenous people who thought of the New World as, home, but it was intended to reduce conflict between Spain and Portugal over the new lands. And essentially what the treaty did is it drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and said Portugal gets east and Spain gets west. And that offered a unique challenge for Spain, because Spain wanted access to the Spice Islands, but because of the treaty, they couldn't do that by going around Africa. And so what they really needed was a route that would go around the Americas, the lands that were discovered by Columbus, and go westerly to the Spice Islands, a western route to the Spice Islands. And that's where Ferdinand Magellan comes in. Now, ironically, Magellan himself was Portuguese, but he brought a proposal to the King of Spain, Charles I, to lead an expedition to identify the western route. And Charles I agreed to fund an expedition that included 5 ships and about 270 sailors. And that expedition kicked off in August of 1519. After spending the winter in South America, Magellan discovered the strait that allows you to go around South America, that's now called the Strait of Magellan, in November of 1520. And by then he was already down to just 3 ships. One had been wrecked, one had mutinied and returned back to Spain. And so those 3 ships went through the Strait of Magellan, and by November 28th, they were the first Europeans to enter the Pacific Ocean. After being the first Europeans to visit the island of Guam, they went on, and by March 21st of 1521 became the first Europeans in the Philippine Island. And there Magellan found an ally in the form of Humabon, who was the Raja or king of the Rajanate of Sipu, which was in the southern part of the Philippine Islands. And Raja Humabon and his wife converted to Catholicism, the first to do so in the Philippines. And then the Raja sent an order throughout his kingdom saying that everybody should convert to Catholicism and that they should send food and supplies for Magellan's ships. Well, the order was generally followed except for just one of Humabon's chieftains, one of the Datu, or the chieftains of the island of Mactan, whose name was Lapu-Lapu. And Lapu-Lapu said that he would not convert to Catholicism and that he would not follow the orders of the King of Spain. And so Humabon suggested that Magellan take his ships over to Mactan and force Lapu-Lapu to submit. It's clear that Magellan was overconfident because he took with him just 60 men. And even though he had warriors of Humabon with him, he told them to stay in the ships because he wanted them to witness the power of his European weapons. The actual battle was on April 27th, and because he left a few of his men to guard his boats, Magellan only had 49 men with him, whereas Lapu-Lapu had 1,500 warriors. And we don't know much about Lapu-Lapu, but it turns out that he was a pretty brilliant tactician, or at least he had Magellan's strengths figured out. I mean, first of all, on the island, there was so much coral and rock out in the ocean that Magellan's ships could not get close enough to use their cannon, and that already denied Magellan some of his most powerful weapons. But then Lapu-Lapu kept his warriors at a good enough distance that Magellan's men with their muskets and crossbows couldn't do a lot of damage, and he waited to charge until they were almost out of ammunition. When his 1,500 men didn't charge, Lapu-Lapu told them, stab at the legs, because while the Spanish wore good armor, they didn't armor their legs. And most importantly, Lapu-Lapu told them, kill the leader, so that they all charged Magellan, because Lapu-Lapu knew that the whole attack would fail if Magellan fell. And so 1,500 guys came to stab Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan was swamped and killed. Now, many of his troops got away, but they lost about 14 other troops in the battle. And why a battle where only 14 died doesn't seem like a big deal, the actual loss of Magellan delayed the Spanish dominance of the Philippines by around 40 years. With the loss of so many people in the battle, the expedition didn't have enough sailors left to operate 3 ships, so one of the ships was abandoned. One tried to return home via the Pacific route, the way that they came, and one decided to try to return home via the Indian Ocean and around the Horn of Africa, and that's the only ship that made it back. Of the 271 sailors that had left on the expedition, there were only 18 on that boat that returned to Spain with Juan Sebastian Elcano that had circumnavigated the globe. We really don't know what happened to Lapu-Lapu. There's no record of his death, but according to local legend, he didn't die. He turned into a stone, and local fishermen still throw coins at a vaguely human-shaped rock in the ocean there to thank Lapu-Lapu for the privilege of fishing in his waters. The Battle of Mactan is important for a few different reasons, starting, of course, with the death of Ferdinand Magellan, who was a very powerful personality and who clearly would have done more in his life if he hadn't ended up on the end of a spear. It also represents the errors that were commonly made by Europeans in the age of discovery and conquest, that arrogance, that underestimating the local population, that overestimating the power of European arms, and that inability or unwillingness to understand local customs and power structures. And those errors would be repeated again and again in the Far East, in the Pacific, in Africa, and in South America. But most of all, the Battle of Mactan is important for the people of the Philippine Islands. I mean, immediately one of the effects was it was many years before Spain could mount another meaningful expedition to the Philippine Islands. But in the long run, Lapu-Lapu has retroactively become the symbol of Philippine resistance to foreign rule, which has really been a cause in the Philippine Islands since the 16th century. And that's a little bit anachronistic because the fight, the Battle of Mactan, was really over local power structures in the kingdom, but the reason that Lapu-Lapu resisted was because he did not want to have a European religion forced on him. And so he is this symbol for people who fight the age of exploration and conquest. There are several statues of Lapu-Lapu. There are the main city in Mactan is named Lapu-Lapu City. Lapu-Lapu's head was on the 1 centavo coin in the 1960s and 1970s. And the people of Mactan still annually reenact the Battle of Mactan. And that's a real irony, because here we have Ferdinand Magellan, who is a man whose navigational skills were so important that there are several geographic features on Earth named after Ferdinand Magellan, but there are actually craters on the moon and on Mars that are named after Ferdinand Magellan, and 2 of the closest galaxies to the Earth are named after Ferdinand Magellan, and yet his death is a symbol to people who oppose everything that his navigational skills brought, which was the theft of their land and their culture. And that irony alone is enough reason for you to know about the 1521 Battle of Mactan.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy about what these episodes tell us about history, interesting connections to other stories, and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. So the two episodes we're talking about today are about explorers, and these are interesting explorers who did very, very different things, but I think both, there's some pieces of these stories that really connect them as well. I think we also, we kind of live in a world today where there seems like there's a lot less to explore, and certainly we have passed the age of this kind of explorer. They're going to be very different kinds, and
we can literally take pictures from space and see what the things that they were looking for are. I mean, I think there's still various kinds of explorations. There's deep sea exploration. We're actually reaching the point where there could literally be space exploration, which is something that we've talked about for a long time, and that might actually come in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
But certainly the world was a very clearly in the 16th century the world was a very different place. But even in the 18th century, in terms of going to find things. And it's still, we still find new species in deep jungle and stuff like that. And so, I think there's still some exploration going along. But the period when, 1 million mariners died of scurvy trying to find a map of the world, that's pretty much over. Yeah. But there's still, if you want to go someplace no one's gone before, people are still, finding things here and there where you can do that.
Yeah. It's interesting to, we've kind of mythologized this era and a lot of these, these explorers. And I think these stories both show us both the ways that we've done that and the ways that the difficulties that they really faced. Which
Absolutely.
is wild.
These are two explorers whose names you would certainly know. Yeah. The purpose of the first episode, the one on Magellan, is I don't think actually that most people realize that Magellan did not successfully complete the voyage. We're just kind of taught Magellan circumnavigated the globe, and actually he got halfway there. Now there's some argument because he had gone the other way before that maybe the two pieces touch, but the first voyage of circumnavigation was not completed by Magellan, and so that says that we have mythologized them a bit, and we talk about it as Magellan's expedition, though it was really an expedition of many more than that. Yeah. And we also make him out to be quite a hero when there was certainly ways that he was not necessarily. As a matter of fact. Lapu-Lapu, the guy that finally, put an end to Magellan, is much more considered a hero in the Philippines than Magellan is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's lots of criticisms, and quite a bit of it's fair about how these explorers went around and treated people. And...
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Magellan was just kidnapping people along the way. He had two people he called Patagonian giants, which are just two guys he grabbed off the beach who, imagine, were surprised. Their family was probably surprised when they didn't get home. And when they first discovered Guam, they the people from Guam stole a boat off them. They probably thought it was a trade for food, which they desperately needed. But they stole a boat off his ship, and so he sent a bunch of guys on shore and just murdered 7 guys, murdered the whole village to the ground, trying to get his skiff back. So there's a lot of criticism about how the Westerners did it, but also you see in the whole story of Magellan, everywhere that he went, kind of the people saw him as a political opportunity. They said, look at these guys, we can use these guys. And it was really, really in the end, what was his undoing was that he was pulled into local politics and,
if there's
ended up in a fight he couldn't win.
If there's some nuance in kind of how that went across, honestly, across the globe, you would say that was true with the Inca. They were in the middle of a civil war. That was true with the Aztecs because of the various peoples they had conquered. They all... this all happened within this context, and there was always local political stuff. And I think that there's
always was, yeah.
There's kind of a...
We see that in European colonization in the early English colonies in the North Americas, that there were always native peoples who could see them as an opportunity if I can ally with them, or if I could turn them against them. Actually, that was one of the first things that Columbus really discovered too, was that it was being drawn into local tribal conflict. So, and that's when you have a couple hundred guys at most. Show up to a place that has 1 million inhabitants, then they're not going to change history by themselves. I guess nothing changes the histories of the past, but they're not going to transform what's going on by themselves. But you can see how local leaders can say, now I can manipulate these people, and you can see actually how in the position they're in, they could be easily manipulated. But I mean, in the end, in the colonial world, I guess they were the manipulators. I don't know. But I mean, these are both stories of that. I mean, these both represent people that were, taking extreme risks to go places, and both of them ended up kind of getting lost in that. Yes.
A lot of it has to do with misunderstanding. I think that, I think it's clear that the Europeans tended to think that they were the enlightened ones. And when we look back, that happens a lot too, is that they think, the natives just didn't know what they were getting into. And I think in a lot of ways, it's much better to look at the natives as that they very much understood a lot of what they were getting into. And that's why they were always working against each other and against or with European powers as they came. And it was much more complex than just, this. Yeah,
I mean, Magellan went to the Battle of Mactan with 40 dudes. And he had allies, but he left them on the ships because he was quite sure that they were so technologically superior that if he took 40 guys with muskets, that would so demonstrate their force that they could defeat a couple thousand dudes with spears. And so, I mean, he clearly believed, that there was just this, that he was morally superior, that Christianity was morally superior, that he was fighting barbarians. And it's clear throughout that certainly Lapu-Lapu understood who he was and what his capabilities were and how to use those. And, said, kill the leader and they'll all run away, and that's exactly how things worked out. So it is a matter, and but of course the Europeans had an outsized influence given the size of the group that they brought with them. But they underestimated the natives in many ways at many times, and many times that caught up with European colonizers or explorers. Yes.
And certainly Magellan probably had heard about this. Was fairly early. I mean, in 1521 is the same year that the Aztec Empire falls. So he hadn't, this was before the Inca, which of course with the Inca, a fairly small number of Spaniards did fight thousands. Thousands.
Because they got there at a critical point though too, when they can make a difference. Because in the middle of a civil war.
But it's so you can see where he had thought, he had probably heard stories of, how amazed and whether those stories were embellished or not, how amazed these natives were with European technology, and he clearly certainly believed that he would be able to just fire his guns and they would simply run.
I think they felt with their armor that they were going to be pretty much invulnerable to their weapons. And I don't know. You and I both played Civilization. You wonder how a phalanx can beat musketeers. Well. There are ways that it can happen.
I do occasionally wonder, you're playing that game and your armor gets destroyed by a legionary or something, and you're like, come on. No number of Romans could blow up my tank.
See, that was the mistake Magellan made. He made that assumption.
I do wonder, Lapu-Lapu doesn't seem to have had any special knowledge. He just seems to have approached the situation.
Was it intentional that he chose a place to defend that would keep their ships too far away, that they could use the ship cannon? Did he know that? He certainly was a good strategist.
Yeah.
He wouldn't be stupid. He was a leader. He was a local leader. But on the other hand, maybe what could have happened there is they fire off their arquebuses and that scares the bejeebus out of Lapu-Lapu's troops, and maybe, and who knows how different history would be if he'd won the Battle of Mactan. But it turns out that the natives are more resilient than he thought they would be. And that did leave his whole expedition in quite a crisis too. It's actually kind of surprising any of them made it home after the death of Magellan.
Well, and it wasn't
their ships were leaking, and
it wasn't even the last.
Fought over leadership.
Later, the other, the guy who converted to Christianity ends up poisoning more of the Spaniards because they were mistreating, which that's fairly typical of the.
So it is, and that's another episode that's not in this one, where one captain, one Sebastian, takes one of the boats and manages to get that sucker home and complete the circumnavigation of the globe, which wasn't even the intent. Wasn't circumnavigation, right? They would have gone back the way that they came. And one ship tried to do that, ended up getting captured by the Portuguese. So, it just, it didn't work out altogether. So it was a more tenuous expedition, honestly, than what I learned when I was in high school and we were talking about the age of discovery. And we didn't really talk all that much, in my era, we didn't talk that much about, how terrible they treated the natives. But we also didn't really talk about what a real miracle it was that any of them managed to make it back. And I didn't know until this is an older episode, this is when I started doing this, I didn't know that Magellan hadn't made it all the way around the world. It was a surprise to me, and if you look at the comments on this video, it's a surprise to a lot of people. So it also represents the foibles of how we've taught history in the past.
Well, and he really is. You don't usually learn that much about his expedition. You learn that he was the first guy to circumnavigate, and it is kind of funny to think that he didn't really. in a technical
the expedition
sense.
ended it. And I mean, the cool thing about the expedition is it did have someone chronicle it, Picifetto, chronicle it the whole way. And so it's hard to see what to read from Picifetto. I mean, there's some ways that might be biased, but at least we get this kind of idea of what happened on that whole expedition.
Yeah, which is amazing. And think of how easy it would have been for no one to make it back. And this essentially to be forgotten.
By the time they were getting across the Pacific, I mean, they were dying of scurvy.
Yeah.
The ship with most of the supplies had turned and gone back, and they had a mutiny, and they lost the ship that had most of the supplies. So they were starving so much that they were eating boot leather. They were catching the rats and eating the rats, and then they were eating the food that the rats had, spoiled. And they were nearly starved by the time. I think the first place that they ran into was Guam. They were nearly starved to death there, and it's a miracle that they survived to get where they were. So I mean, the whole story too of it is just how dangerous exploration is. There's an awful lot of these explorers, like Sir John Franklin too. I mean, there's a lot of these explorers that never came home. I mean, great explorers, people that we have, all this respect for. And in the end, Roald Amundsen one day got into a plane to go search for a lost Italian explorer and was never seen again. I mean, exploring is still a risky business. I mean, we saw that when the submarine, crashed this last year too. And so, I mean, when you go where no one's gone before, then you're always taking a risk. And some of that risk is you might not come home. And one of those that didn't was Ferdinand Magellan. Yeah.
And yet he's remembered for doing something incredible, even if maybe he didn't
absolutely
do it quite in the way.
I mean, there's an awful lot named after him, a lot in space named after him. But he's remembered in the Philippines because every year they reenact the Battle of Mactan, and of course we know who won that particular fight.
Yeah, and that's an interesting piece too. I think sometimes it's really interesting to kind of see history from the point of view of some other people, because that's
absolutely
it is difficult sometimes to kind of get outside of your own narratives and stuff. I mean, that's
you have to look at a different side to stop seeing Magellan as a hero, where he's not necessarily seen as a hero in the place where the Spanish eventually conquered and controlled for such a long period of time.
I can understand why the Filipinos maybe don't, because he was the first of essentially a wave that eventually colonizes all of the Philippines.
Would take over.
Plenty of things that they might wish didn't happen.
But you have to, with all the leaders there, you have to wonder, would Lapu-Lapu be remembered at all?
True.
If he hadn't killed Ferdinand Magellan.
Well, and he's barely remembered as it is. We
we don't
remember
really
his
know
name.
much
We
about
just
him,
don't know that much about him. Yeah.
There's very very little record of who Lapu-Lapu was, but I mean he was on the Philippine currency for a long time.
Yeah, it's amazing, right?
There's cultures. He's the hero because he's the one that fought the Europeans when they first showed up. But he's quite possibly the sort of person whose name would have been long forgotten, were it not that he killed the guy who we remember, on the other side of the world.
And so his name is, and it's possible. I was looking into some of it. This is possibly, we talked about how they were manipulated and how the natives were playing into their politics. It seems like Magellan's understanding was that the leader he talked to, that this was like one of his lords,
one of his vassals, essentially. Yeah,
and it's not real clear that that's true.
You might not say.
I read one thing that
pretty
suggested that Lapu-Lapu might have actually been the more powerful of the two in that relationship.
It's pretty clear that they're like, that guy, go mess with him.
Yeah, why don't you? Because in the end, that doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
Well, whatever happens there is like, well, either that's going to help me out.
Where's this going to happen? They might kill Magellan. We don't care.
I don't care that much about Magellan. And gosh, he didn't even use the native soldiers who just hung out in their boats.
Supposed to be impressed by his success in battle.
Yeah, which if it had worked out the way he wanted it to, could have been a very different.
Might have. Yeah, who knows?
Maybe
it's hard to say. I mean, it's if he had succeeded in the Battle of Mactan, how much would that have changed things? It might have sped the Spanish conquest of the Philippines, or they were still a small number of people in leaky boats by that point. So maybe maybe not. It's hard to say.
They tend to any of these stories that we talk about, when they're usually treated fairly well by the locals, at least at first, and the Europeans are generally in rougher condition
they're
than they
welcomed
want to
quickly,
let on. They're very many miles from home, and it took them months to get here, and half their guys are dead, and they all don't want that.
They always have dissension in the ranks too. There's always seems to be disagreements, and
Yeah, there's always
And
someone.
it's interesting because this is in the early part of the 16th
Yeah.
century, and we're also going to be talking about the 18th century today, and very similar
Remarkably
circumstances in some different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing I wanted to talk about, this was an older video. I always wonder when we look at some of these older ones. Honestly, in some ways, the only real difference. I mean, there's some quality difference just from your equipment.
Absolutely,
but is the
well, I mean,
length.
it's always, you can certainly tell the ones that were where the lights were yellow, and where it sounds like I'm talking into a can. And I have reinvested some of that we've made in order to put together better equipment. And of course, now I have a writer, so which we'll see the other episode we talked about today. You wrote at the time, that was just me. And if you want to believe it, these early episodes, they were handwritten in a notebook. I have it laying around somewhere. They weren't even written down. So the only reason we have a record of them is because YouTube produces a transcript, and that's how we can transcript these early episodes.
Keep a hold of the.
It's clear that I believe that this is the first episode where I wore the bow tie.
Oh, wow. See, that makes this...
This is the one that set the whole standard for the History Guy bow tie thing. And that's actually a Mickey Mouse bow tie that I'm wearing that I had.
Wow.
I happened to have, and I put on one day, and people said, that's cool. And
this is kind of part of the... Yeah, that makes this a part of the history of the History Guy.
The history of the History Guy. I know this is a podcast, you can't see it, but trust me, when you see it, I'm wearing a Mickey Mouse bow tie long before I was getting free bow ties from the tie bar. And this, I think, is the first episode that really set me on the path of wearing bow ties, so much so that now if people see me out in public, I'm not wearing a bow tie, they don't believe that I am who I am.
It is a little weird because I've known you for, longer than YouTube.
Yeah.
And it's, so I'm used to seeing you without a bow tie, but no one else.
Yeah, most of the time I don't wear a bow tie. Yeah, even though there are people who've seen hundreds of hours of me wearing nothing but bow ties.
They always make that comment when they see it. They're like, oh, where's the bow tie?
That's it, yeah.
So, if you are a fan of the History Guy, either the podcast or the YouTube or both, and you enjoy learning about this history that deserves to be remembered, there are some ways that you can support us with a little bit of financial, a little bit of money. And one of the best ways to do that is through Patreon. We've got some other ways to do it. You can become a member on YouTube. We have a page on locals, but Patreon is kind of one of our main places, and it's a great place if you want to help support the History Guy and make these episodes possible.
Yeah, it's just a really easy place. If you like what we're doing, if you want to help pay my salary and Josh's salary and feed the cats, then you can go give, whatever amount of money you want. And depending on how much money you give, we'll send you some stuff. We have challenge coins. We have stickers. You can even get a custom to History Guy bow tie. And even at the top tier, if you really want to donate, I'll sign a photograph for you. You can get a History Guy autograph. Of course, it's not about the tchotchkes. It's really about we believe that history deserves to be remembered. If you do too, even $2, $3, $5 a month can really make a big difference to us being able to continue to do what we're doing and continue to produce these podcasts and the YouTube channel. So that's patreon.com/thehistoryguy, patreon.com/thehistoryguy. It's really the very best way to support the History Guy.
Next up, the History Guy tells the story of Vitus Bering and the Great Northern Expedition.
You probably know something of the story of the European discovery of North America. Vikings probably first reached the shores of North America around 1,000 years ago, and of course Columbus brought back word of the New World about 500 years later. But while Europeans were colonizing the east coast of North America, the west coast of North America was still largely unknown to Europeans. It wasn't until the 18th century that Russia decided to explore their Pacific coast, sending a Danish explorer to map the farthest reaches of their dominion and determine once and for all whether Asia and North America were connected. That Danish explorer's name was very nearly lost to history, and while you might recognize the name today, you've probably never heard his story. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The territory that makes up modern Russia was conquered largely from various Golden Horde successor states during their decline. In the 1400s, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, sometimes called Muscovite Russia, began to expand from its core around Moscow west into Europe and north, south, and east into the areas now controlled by modern Russia. In 1547, Ivan the Terrible was crowned the first Tsar, thus creating the Tsardom of Russia. After Ivan, successive Russian Tsars and merchants pressed eastward, finding little organized resistance in the Khanates and natives of Siberia. Russian policy was harsh on the Siberian natives. Russian agents collected yasak, or fur tribute, from the people there and forced them to adopt Russian ways. As in America, local populations were devastated by diseases like smallpox. Despite continual resistance from Siberia's peoples, by the time Peter the Great became Tsar in 1682, Russia had pressed its control across the continent and even fought a war with China. In Europe, however, Russia was seen as a backwater, archaic, and barbaric state. Tsar Peter explored Europe incognito and decided to make Russia relevant to Europe. He made major cultural, military, and social reforms to bring Russian society nearer Europe's. This included a focus on scientific study, and in 1723 he began drawing foreign scholars to his newly built capital of St. Petersburg to educate Russian scientists and grow his own academy. Peter's health began deteriorating in 1724, and his long-held plans to explore Siberia's eastern reaches suddenly became a priority. He became interested in the idea that the continents connected, and so he ordered an expedition to be made post-haste to the far-off coast of Kamchatka. His orders were to prepare ships in Kamchatka and to search for the place that land might be joined to America, and from there processes to some settlement belonging to a European power. Preparations began, and on January 9, 1725, Peter asked a Danishman serving in the Russian Navy named Vitus Bering to command the voyage. Vitus Bering was born in Denmark on August 5, 1681. His family was reasonably well off, and several of his brothers attended university. Vitus, however, took a different path, and by 15 he was serving as a ship's boy. He traveled extensively after that, going as far afield as India and the Dutch East Indies, as well as the Caribbean and European colonies in the Americas. He completed naval officer training in Amsterdam. In 1704, Bering enlisted with the quickly evolving Russian Navy, which was then fighting the protracted Great Northern War, which lasted from 1700 to 1721. By 1720, Bering was a second captain, roughly equivalent to the U.S. Navy rank of commander, though he only served in non-combat roles. He married the daughter of a Swedish merchant and moved permanently to Russia. In 1724, he left the Navy briefly because of a lack of promotion, but rejoined later that year with a promotion to first captain. Tsar Peter chose Bering for his experience around the world, and apparently because Bering was well-liked within the Navy. The plan was to travel overland through Siberia until they reached the Pacific, and the expedition left at the end of January 1725, the same month that the Tsar died. The 34-person expedition took only what it couldn't get in Kamchatka, such as anchors, 8 cannons, rigging, and sails. More joined the parties that traveled east, a journey that was constantly delayed by intractable government agents. A popular saying was, in Siberia, God is a long way up, and the Tsar a long way off. The journey took more than 2 years, by river, horse, and sled. At least 46 men from Bering's party deserted as they fought hunger and blizzards in the sparse frontier. The party finally gathered in the tiny town of Okhotsk in June of 1727. From there, the party would have to travel by sea to Kamchatka. The party repaired one previously built boat and built a new one, which they optimistically dubbed the Fortuna. It took most of another year to travel to Kamchatka. There they launched Bering's primary ship, the Archangel Gabriel, on June 9, 1728. The party finally sailed north up the coast in July, but struggled to speak with the locals to determine the names of local geography. That summer, Bering sailed for the first time through the strait that would bear his name. Unbeknownst to him, he was not the first explorer to do so. Some 80 years previously, a Cossack named Semyon Dezhnev had sailed through the strait seeking furs. But Dezhnev, who was likely illiterate, doesn't seem to have recognized the importance of his discovery, and by 1728 his expedition was largely forgotten, although some record of it would be rediscovered in 1736. On August 8th, they reached a cape where the land turned westwards, and there met several Kamchatkans. The party discussed whether they could be sure that the land turned westward for good, thus proving that Asia and the Americas were different land masses. Ultimately, with sea ice already advancing and the ship damaged, Bering decided to sail for a few days more and then turn back on August 16th. Incredibly, the party had not actually reached the furthest east point of mainland Asia, for the cape is named after Dezhnev, nor had they discovered Alaska, which on a clear day would have been visible at times. In the spring of 1729, Bering returned to his camp in Kamchatka, ready to make the arduous journey back to St. Petersburg to report his findings. No longer carrying the supplies that they needed to bring with him, it only took them a year to return to the Russian capital. Bering was promoted to his first noble rank for his work. At least 15 of his men had died on the journey, and the expedition had commandeered food, horses, and dogs freely from native Siberians. They brought back useful maps of the coast of Siberia and good, though not definitive, proof of the sea between Asia and the Americas. With Russia now considered a real power, reports of the journey were spread widely throughout Europe. Bering wasn't satisfied with the results of his first expedition, however, especially as it remained uncertain that he'd actually proved the separation of the two continents. He proposed a second expedition, much more ambitious in scope and with the explicit goal of reaching North America. The plan was known as the Great Northern Expedition, and it would eventually become so expensive that it ranks as one of history's largest exploration enterprises. Politicians, the Admiralty, and advisors to the new Empress all got involved, piling on to the scientific and economic goals of the expedition. They wanted ships to find a navigable route along the northern coast, to send the first Russian delegations to Japan, and even to establish the Siberian Postal Service, in addition to reaching the coast of North America. A large number of scientists were attached to the expedition, generally to learn everything that has scientific interest. Bering was concerned by the size of the expedition. The tiny frontier towns had had trouble handling his much smaller expedition, but his influence faded as more people became involved. One of his lieutenants from the first trip, Alexei Chirikov, was elevated almost to a co-commander. While Bering was completing his preparations, a different voyage would actually beat him to Alaska. Some members of the first expedition, led by Mikhail Govzdev, sighted Alaska near the modern Cape Prince of Wales in 1732. Bering, with his wife and his younger children, left in 1733, shortly after Chirikov had left with 500 people, a number that would swell to several thousand, including laborers. Like the first trek, the journey was long and arduous. The huge party strained the resources of small frontier towns that were expected to accommodate them, and Bering was delayed trying to direct other parts of the expedition. The delays were so significant that Bering wasn't able to return to Okhotsk until 1737. There, the expedition had refitted the Archangel Gabriel and built 2 new ships. The original cost of the expedition was budgeted to be 12,000 rubles, but by 1727 expenses had already exceeded 300,000. Bering took most of the blame for the delays and faced personal criticism. Members of the expedition said he found little success in whatever he did. His own salary was halved, and supplies and money came irregularly, if at all. Men starved while waiting. Ships were able to reach Japan, but the American-bound ships weren't ready until 1740. Before leaving, Bering's family returned to St. Petersburg. He would never see them again. The government was considering ending the project entirely, spurring Bering to quickly sail. He captained the St. Peter, which reached the Kamchatka Peninsula finally in 1740, followed by the St. Paul, captained by Chirikov. A new town had been built to support the expedition, which Bering dubbed Petropavlovsk, literally the city of Peter and Paul, after the names of the ships. He spent the winter preparing for the actual voyage, including recruiting Georg Steller, a pioneer in Alaskan natural history, and for whom Steller's sea eagle, Steller's sea cow, and Steller's jay are named, among others, to accompany him. In the summer of 1741, 8 years after he first set off from St. Petersburg, Bering and Chirikov finally set sail for America. Early in the expedition, the 2 ships lost each other, but both continued east. Chirikov was first to see land on July 15th. He set a group of men ashore who failed to reappear after 5 days, and then a second group after them, which also disappeared. Chirikov decided that the boats and 15 men were lost and sailed for home. Without those boats, he couldn't get more fresh water. The crew sighted several islands in the Aleutian chain on the return and reached Petropavlovsk in October, critically low on water. Bering caught sight of high snow-covered mountains, and among them a high volcano on July 16, 1741, 450 miles north of Chirikov's sighting. They were the first Europeans to see Mount St. Elias, the 4th tallest mountain in North America. The crew landed on Kayak Island to take on water. Here, Georg Steller found a recently abandoned native camp. A fire was still smoldering. He and his Cossack entered the thick rainforest, where he found a cellar dug into the ground. He stole samples from this cache, smoked salmon, bark, grasses, and arrows. Bering sent his men to raid the site completely, leaving in return silk, kettles, knives, beads, and tobacco. Steller wished to make contact, but Bering was already concerned about the return voyage. Steller was affronted by his treatment, exemplified in his furious complaint, "So you've come only to take American water? To Asia?" Bering wanted to sail straight for home, but his lieutenants overruled him, instead following the coastline so they could chart it, extending the journey by weeks. Finally, on August 10th, now late in the season for sailing so far north, Bering convinced them to sail directly for Kamchatka. Scurvy had begun to set in among the crew, and 60-year-old Bering himself was soon bedridden. They landed to collect fresh water again, and on the same day, Nikita Shumagin became the first man to die of scurvy. Bering named the islands after him. Steller was able to temporarily stave off scurvy by collecting magnificent anti-scorbic plants. His belief that scurvy was caused by diet was well ahead of conventional medicine at the time. The ship was buffeted by storm after storm for weeks, and scurvy struck more of the crew. Soon nearly all of the men were ill, unable to even put up the sails. Steller reports daily deaths. On November 4th, after nearly 5 months at sea, they sighted land that they hoped was Kamchatka. "The half-dead crawled out to sea," Steller said. They landed, but soon learned they were on an island. They were still more than 300 miles from Kamchatka. In his 1889 work, Vitus Bering, the discoverer of the Bering Strait, Danish geographer Peter Lorentzen described the location. The island upon whose shores Bering, after a voyage of 4 months, was cast was a high, rocky, and uninviting country. By then the expedition was in desperate condition. Lorentzen wrote, "The sick and dying were seen on every hand. Some complained of the cold, others of hunger and thirst, and the majority of them were so afflicted with scurvy that their gums, like a dark brown sponge, grew over and entirely covered the teeth." Bering's condition steadily worsened. According to Lorentzen, his 60 years of age, his heavy build, the trials and tribulations he had experienced, his subdued courage, and his disposition to quiet and inactivity all tended to aggravate his disease. But he would nevertheless, says Steller, without doubt have recovered if he had gotten back to Avacha, where he could have obtained proper nourishment and enjoyed the comfort of a warm room. On December 19th, Vitus Bering died. Steller said of him, "Sad as his death was, that intrepidity and seriousness with which he prepared to meet death was most worthy of admiration." Lorentzen attributed his death to inflammation of the bowels, and for 2.5 centuries it was generally assumed his death was caused by scurvy, but an analysis of his remains in 1991 determined that he likely died of heart failure. The St. Peter was by then in too poor a shape to sail. The rest of the crew were stranded for 10 months before they managed to build a new ship from the wreckage and finally returned to Kamchatka. Only 46 of the 77 men aboard the St. Peter survived the expedition. At first it seemed as if Bering's expedition would be as forgotten as Brezhnev's. The results of the exploration was a secret, jealously guarded by the Russian state, which was afraid that other European powers would try to steal their newfound land. Lorentzen explains that the reports of Bering and his co-workers, which would have filled cartloads with manuscripts, were buried within the archives of the Admiralty. Well, Bering was neither the first European to see Alaska, nor even the first to pass through the strait that now bears his name. His expeditions established the Russian claim to what is now Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, what was then called Russian America. Lorentzen described him as Russia's first navigator and first great discoverer. It was British explorer James Cook who is credited with naming the strait after Bering in 1778, and now many local features are named after Bering. The island on which he died is called Bering Island. It is in the Bering Sea, and the land bridge that once connected Asia and North America is called Beringia. Peter Lorentzen noted the irony. Thus it was West Europe who, in the last century, rescued Bering's name from oblivion.
So as we mentioned in our last conversation, there are a lot of differences. Of course, this story takes place 200 years after Magellan's, but in some ways there are a lot of similarities in how difficult this kind of exploration is and how shoestring they seem to keep it together. So many places where it could have failed. Just like Magellan.
Yeah, it's actually, there's a huge difference between exploring up in the North Arctic and the South Pacific.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that by the end, both groups were dying of scurvy. And, that's the same thing when you're at sea for a long period of time, when you have trouble getting supplies. And so that's really an interesting similarity. One of the things that's interesting, Magellan was not Spanish. He'd become a Spanish citizen, but Magellan was actually Portuguese. He'd gone to the King of Portugal first, and when the King of Portugal didn't want to support the expedition, he'd gone to Spain. Well, of course, Vitus Bering was not a Russian. Vitus Bering was Danish, right? And so it's the same sort of, you had a great explorer that had a nation that wasn't going to support him as the great explorer, and so he winds up exploring on someone else's behalf. That's really quite interesting. It's a mirror between the two. And then they both, totally risked their lives going to sea with a small group. And they both faced the sorts of dangers and risks that you do. Of course, there's different risks when you're living in the North Atlantic or in the North Pacific there, and it's it's minus 50 degrees. That's a bit different than if you're in the South Pacific.
But they still, the basic truth that exploring very far away from civilization, or at least from your civilization, and having a very difficult time. Everything is a possible failure. Whether your ship is going to sink, or you're not going to find the food, or because they didn't know where they were going. They weren't even sure. If
they weren't sure what was on the other side.
Yeah.
Neither one of them knew what they were both going literally into the great unknown. Of course, Vitus Bering had the additional obstacles that he had to get. He had to get across Russia even to get to where he could make a boat, and that was not an easy time to do that.
Yep.
It was, and that what they were saying, that even the Tsarist officials could be very intransigent because even though he had been sent there by the Tsar, like they said, the Tsar was far from there.
The Tsar was far away. You wonder. One of the things that kind of amazes me is that Russia has been able to hold on to so much of that land, despite the fact that it's very clear at this point that they had an extremely tenuous control over it. They were getting
At the time that there was in terms of actual the actual control by the empire.
Russia is still almost all their population lives west of the Urals, and so everybody there's this huge part of Russia which they are better able to. I mean, they've got railroads across it now. Better able to reach.
That was a long path too. Yeah. But I mean, the Russo-Japanese War, part of the problem was how do you even get troops there? How do you protect that? How did they protect it over this period of time? They essentially sold British North America because they were afraid if they went to war with or Russian North America. Excuse me. They sold Russian North America because they were afraid that if they went to war with the British, they couldn't defend it from the British. Yet somehow they have defended that huge, vast swath of territory clear on the east side of Russia. It is an extraordinary story, and this is this story shows how difficult it was to do that. How difficult it was for them to even get from one. It's clear
years.
The Tsar did not have a whole lot of authority. When you got to Kamchatka.
No, I mean your authority that you're like, I'm here from the Tsar. They're like, okay, better have something more convincing than that, probably. to really.
What are you gonna do? Tell on me?
It'll take you years to get there and years to get back, and by then no one will care. But it's also I mean, they didn't have it very well explored. And that was part of why, I mean, one of the things that Bering did in this journey is really explored. I mean, they learned a lot about the rivers. They learned a lot about kind of this understanding of how you would get across this land. And that had a lot to do. We end up taking most of it out. Because the journey there takes, and he goes there several times, takes forever, and every step of the way is a challenge, and parts of the party are reaching it, and they're waiting for other parts, and they don't have food, and they're waiting for various supply wagons, and they're trying to move that by river, and they're not even 100% sure where the river goes.
Yeah, I mean, our episodes they're only around 10 to 15 minutes long, and we do want to stick to a story that's going to be interesting, but it is, certainly if you wanted to tell the whole story of the Bering expeditions, you could take much, much longer just to talk about even getting to where they got the boat, and, we want to focus on the exploration part of it, and the Bering Sea, and the Bering Strait, and Bering Island, and all the places
so we end up
kind of for.
Skipping over a lot of it. But there's certainly,
we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk about him hauling boat anchors from Moscow to Kamchatka. Yeah,
which was difficult, and they there's some stuff here that they didn't necessarily, that the Tsar expected that they could just take whatever they needed from the locals, and I mean they did, which was always challenging because no one in Siberia ever had really extra food.
Or dogs, or any of the things that they were taking. And I don't think they probably believed that the Tsar was going to come pay them back. So they had to literally just confiscate stuff from locals, and the locals obviously wanted to protect their stuff.
And they had trouble.
It was it's certainly an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and
a very different challenge than say Magellan faced. Yeah.
Supposedly he was going through. Vitus and all of his people were going through land that was controlled by Russia the entire time. He never left Russia, and yet the Tsarist officials in these various little towns tended to run these areas like in their own personal fiefdom, where they have probably the only significant building for hundreds of miles, and everybody else is living off in just miles and miles of wilderness, and it's wild that that Russia kept all of that together, and that Bering was able to get through all of it honestly, without just ending up giving up, because you had to be pretty.
Well, twice, right?
Yeah,
because
twice.
He went and then straight, and they went all the way back to Moscow, and then he came all the way back for another expedition
on an absolutely even crazier, because the Great Northern Expedition, as they call it, absolutely out of control. It was much more about the ambition, because this was kind of a period. It was a little bit like kind of this like space race of science, where everyone was trying to prove that we're so good at science, we can do all this stuff, and Peter wanted to prove that Russia was European and was up with all of that stuff, and they weren't essentially barbarians from the east someplace, and so that was why this was turned into such a huge expedition. But there was, to be honest, there was just never any way to wrangle the whole thing. And Bering was kind of set up to fail in that he gets a lot of the trouble for it going so far over budget and it being so difficult. And he didn't ask to have, every scientific person in Europe essentially send along something to be a part of this expedition. He had a hard enough time getting there the first time, and then they want him to carry, 50 times as many things all the way back. And it wasn't that much easier to get there the second time. At least he knew what path he was taking, but there's all these different problems, and gosh, and that's all
the politics and that. I mean, so there's it's a very rich story. There's a lot more to it than he just got in a boat. And of course, part of the story is the parts that he explored might well have been someone there before him.
Yeah.
And whose records were eventually kind of uncovered to say, oh, maybe there was this. What was he? Was a fur trader that had already been through some of these areas,
and who apparently reached the furthest eastern part of Asia, and apparently his story wasn't told. Although he's got something named after him too, but certainly not the way Bering does. Now we talk about Beringia, which that's Bering going back into the past essentially.
Back into time, if they say you can't change history, I mean, in a way, Bering did when they named things thousands of years before Beringia. But but it still gets down to just this really fascinating story. Supplies, disagreement among the captains, the two ships lose each other. I mean, it is a truly dramatic story. People start dying. He wasn't killed by natives, but it's interesting that much of his crew was suffering from scurvy in the same way that Magellan's crew was suffering from scurvy.
And they even had a guy who apparently kind of thought that he knew what scurvy was and wanted them to, have a diet that would help him. They didn't really buy it, but he was well ahead.
Before anybody understood that,
And Europe didn't understand that at the time, that they needed, oranges to keep them from dying of scurvy. And of course, Steller survives the whole thing, and his journals and what he said about it is a good chunk of why we know as much as we do. But their first journey on his first expedition, where he travels north and still manages not to find Alaska. Nowadays, we can look at him and be like, "Oh my gosh, he was so close."
Yeah, you can see it from there. Yeah.
He was this close. He could have seen Alaska on a clear day, and he didn't. And I wonder, for them, they had no idea. They still weren't. He wanted to go back partially because he felt like they hadn't conclusively proven that Asia and North America were separate. And that's
separate. You've gone far enough north to see if there was a connection.
Yeah, which is an interesting piece. But then he comes back on the second time and he does manage to reach Alaska, even though apparently he's not the first guy to have actually seen some of that. But they're the first ones to see that mountain. It's amazing that there were lots of tribes and stuff living along that coastline, and he never made any contact. Well, except for they find a camp and they find that cellar.
Yeah, they did find a camp and so they found some evidence. But the other boat though had sent away two longboats full of guys that never came back, and they might have been killed by natives. But it is
a good chance of that. But they also could have died any number of other
ways. They could have died. Yeah. Maybe they were just sending them to a place that wasn't navigable and they all drowned. But it is when you're there. It feels very much like Magellan.
Yeah.
You're just out. You are so far from home. How do you find supply? How do you find anything that's going on? And yet they continue to do their exploration. They continue to map, and that's extraordinary.
Apparently, Bering
just like Magellan, Bering doesn't make it home.
Bering had to fight them because Bering wanted to turn back sooner than they did. They wanted to do more exploration, and honestly, the journey seems to have gone pretty well. Until they're getting to that kind of end part, and then everything just falls apart so quickly. They run out of food, and then people start dying of scurvy, and then there's hundreds of miles.
They wind up on a very barren island, a barren island, rock island in the middle of nowhere, and that's where Vitus Bering died.
That was unfortunate. 300 miles from Kamchatka. Yeah. After all of that, they were that close, and there was nothing they could do, and no one knew they were there, and good luck accidentally stumbling upon them. It's amazing that any of them were able to get off of that island. And that's again, how close it was. And then they did, despite everything, manage to bring back just a bunch of stuff, of scientific stuff. And it's so funny that Bering is almost buried not because he, he didn't have a record of his expedition, but because the Russians didn't want anyone else
Didn't want
to
to
know.
share it. Yeah, they didn't want anybody to know what they'd found. Yeah,
Well,
which is funny, given that the reason that they'd send them was to prove what scientists they are, and then they don't want to tell anybody.
tell anyone about that. There's apparently just
almost lost to bureaucracy.
wagon loads. Can you imagine all of that stuff? He travels all the way across Russia, and then they manage to get all that stuff back across Russia. And the Russians are like, oh, we better lock that up in a cellar someplace.
It's like the end of late Raiders of the Lost Ark there, yeah.
This is never going to come out. It's
top people.
It really is an interesting, and that's a piece of, you wonder, well, I'm not sure that we have a journey quite as ambitious as Bering's that's, totally buried or something. But you wonder what stuff we don't know is hidden in some giant warehouse or in the basement of a monastery someplace it's just not been translated or
whole expeditions, because Bering's could have been forgotten.
Could have been.
And it's really kind of surprised that it wasn't. So who knows what else might have happened, what else might have been explored, or might have done, and the record is simply lost. I mean, it's interesting, all this, we never found the logbooks from the Franklin expedition, or why they disappeared, but we also don't know for sure where Genghis Khan is buried. So I mean, it's for all that you talk about history, there's still a lot of history that's lost, that's missing, and we're still looking for answers.
We might learn about it. I just saw the tombs in Macedon, in modern Greece, where Alexander. We don't have any idea where Alexander is.
We don't know where Alexander is.
But they're still fighting over who the bodies are in these royal tombs, and whether they're his son and his brother, and they're still arguing over that. So these are very important people that we, very important historically people. We don't know any of this stuff, and we're fighting about that. And it's interesting what we'll be able to prove and how much we'll be able to learn with new information. And I hope that we continue.
That's a great lesson to learn from Vitus Bering. Is there's a good chance that people probably know who he is because of the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait, but there's a very good chance that you would never know who he was. That his record would still be buried in a vault somewhere. And so it shows you how easily history is lost, and then that gives you a good reason to understand why history deserves to be remembered, because it's so easily lost.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.